Hello, Rabbi. My question today is about Daniel chapter 9. I was discussing this with some Christians the other day, and they were explaining to me that it's a prophecy about how the Messiah is supposed to come and die before the year 29 CE. And I was explaining to them that this wasn't the case, that the Messiah was not supposed to come before the destruction of the second temple. And they were telling me that it was. They were counting on one of Jeremiah's prophecies, and they were kind of confusing it. I myself am a little confused on it, and I was trying to explain it to them as best I can, but I get a little confused about where to start counting.
That is a key question, and is when do you start counting the 70 weeks? Moreover, Christians really don't know what to do with that, because as soon as you ask them when do you start counting, it's conversation closed. In most cases, when talking to a Christian, you can very quickly and efficiently orient the conversation in a way that the Christian realizes there's a problem. Like when talking about Isaiah 53, always begin by asking who's speaking. Always. That's not what they expect. When discussing Daniel 9, always ask, when do you start counting? We know when we start counting, it's the destruction of the first temple. Go back to Daniel 9, verse 1 and 2. The Chorvot Yerushalayim. Daniel is standing a half a century after the destruction of the first temple. We know that because those are the first words of Daniel 9. Daniel 9 begins by saying that I am here in the year of Darius the Mede. Okay? Stop. Why is that? That's the whole key. The whole key is that Daniel is standing in the first year of Darius the Mede. Why is this important? And it's okay to ask a question like, why is that significant? They'll have no clue. But that's everything, because Darius the Mede, who very quickly is replaced by Cyrus the Great, emerges after the destruction of the Babylonian Empire, a half a century after the first temple was destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? That's very critical. So first I want to answer you very quickly. You need to also ask the question of, there are 6 things that were told in Daniel 9, verse 24, that are to occur at the culmination of the 70 weeks. For example, that sin would come to an end. And that's how it begins. There would be everlasting righteousness. All prophecy will be completed. Well, if this is talking about Jesus, how did sin come to an end? Really? There's no sin in the world? Really? It literally says that it'll be the end of transgression. So right away, the Christians are in enormous trouble. Very quickly, the time that you begin counting is from the destruction of the first temple, and you go forward 490 years. The second temple stood for 420 years. The Babylonian exile was 70 years. That's 490 years. Daniel made a mistake when he was contemplating or calculating or considering the prophecies of Jeremiah. How do you know that? It says that. In Daniel 9, verse 1 and 2, Daniel is very distressed. So you've got to understand this, or you just won't understand what's happening here. Daniel was looking at 2 passages in Jeremiah, which seem at first glance to be the same prophecy of the same period of time. And the 2 passages that Daniel had in view that caused him distress was Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 12, and Jeremiah 29, verse 10. Now, those 2 prophecies at first glance seem like they're the same, and that's what Daniel thought. It was a mistake, and the angel Gabriel is sent to Daniel to correct him. But let's explain this. Daniel views these 2 prophecies. The first prophecy of Jeremiah 25, verse 12, is that Babylon would be destroyed, would come to an end at the end of 70 years. The context, you might as well know this, is Jeremiah is trying to persuade the Jews not to rebel against the Babylonian Empire, which is a theme that makes up a large bulk of the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is saying, God's not on your side, don't do this. It doesn't work at the end. But one of the arguments he puts forward is the Babylonian Empire is done after 70 years. Like, just wait. You just stop, wait, and the Babylonian Empire is going to disappear. Okay? But there is nothing in Jeremiah 25:12 that speaks about the restoration of the Jewish people. This is very important. It's only about the Babylonian Empire coming to an end, which the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, only was around for 7 decades. Now, Jeremiah 29 verse 10, on the other hand, which also speaks of 70 years, is not speaking about the destruction of the Babylonian Empire, but is speaking about the restoration of the Jewish people to their land, which is really quite different. Daniel is standing there. The Babylonian Empire has just collapsed, but nothing's happening. The Jews are still in Bavel. The Jews are still in Babylon. The Jews aren't returning. What's going on? You can only imagine how the consternation that gripped the prophet. Oh my God. The Babylonian Empire has collapsed, but all the Jews are still in Bavel. There's no hint. There's nothing to suggest the Jews are returning. What's happening here? He realized that the time to start counting is the destruction of the temple, Chorvot Yerushalayim. And the angel, he engages in a prayer that continues for 16 verses, all the way to Daniel chapter 9, verse 18 and 19, where he thinks that what has occurred here is that a curse of Leviticus 26, verse 18, this past week's Parsha, has been triggered, where the exile of the Jews is not 70 years, but is multiplied times 7 is 490 years. That means he is very, very upset. So the key point is the angel Gabriel is sent to him and begins to unpack for him the prophecy of the future. And that essentially is that from the time of the destruction of the first temple, moving forward 7 weeks, each day is a year, so 7 weeks is 49 years or a half a century, someone emerges who is a Mashiach. It's very important. And that's Cyrus, who gives the order, the command, to restore and rebuild Yerushalayim and the temple. That's only Cyrus, and that's Isaiah 44, verse 28, and 45:1. That chapter break is artificial. 44:28 is the last passage of that chapter, and 45:1 explicitly identifies Cyrus as the person who gives the command to restore and to build Yerushalayim. Remember what we said at the beginning of this, that Daniel is standing in the time of Darius the Mede, which means he's only months away from Cyrus, who gives the command for the Jews to leave Bavel and to go back to Yerushalayim to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, rebuild the Commonwealth. And you see that at the beginning of the book of Ezra. And you see it also at the very end of the book of Chronicles. Okay, and Cyrus is called the Mashiach. He's explicitly called the Mashiach in Isaiah 45, verse 1. One caveat, in Tanakh, the Hebrew word Mashiach appears 39 times, and what is counterintuitive, in none of those places it referring to the Messiah that we call the Messiah. The trick, the sleight of hand here in Daniel 9 is that in Christian Bibles, whereas the other 37 times that the word Messiah appears, it's translated as an anointed one. Only in Daniel 9, in these passages, verse 24 through 27, is it translated as Messiah with a capital M, and a definite article is inserted, but it doesn't exist in the Hebrew. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on here. We are then told for 62 weeks the sanctuary will be rebuilt, a street in Moat, but in troubled times. It'll be a very difficult time. And in fact, the second temple is marked by upheaval, constant upheaval. With the exception of a very brief Maccabean period, the second temple was a Jewish commonwealth where the Jews were a vassal state under another empire. Initially the Persian Empire, subsequently the Greek Empire, and then subsequently the Roman Empire. Now, the last week comes into view in Daniel 9, and the last week, that means the last 7 years, is divided in half, because something horrible happens in the last half a week where the sacrificial system comes to an end and the temple is utterly destroyed. Now, what happened 3.5 years before the temple is destroyed? So the temple is destroyed in the year 70. So dial that back 3.5 years. What occurs in 66? That's right. That's the Great War that Titus, who was the general of Rome under the emperorship of Vespasian, goes to war with the Jews, with Judea. The war goes for 3.5 days, meaning a half a week. And the anointed one there, or an anointed one there, is cut off, which means the destruction of the priesthood. Sacrifices come to an end, utterly come to an end. Now, when in the term there is Yikares Mashiach, an anointed one is cut off. That's either the high priest or the priesthood. What that means is the following. I'm a priest. I'm a Kohen. I'm a direct descendant of Aaron. Now, although I'm a priest, and there are laws that apply to me, for example, I can't come into contact with the dead, and there are a number of prohibitions that are applied to a priest. The things that I'm supposed to be engaging in, if a temple were standing, namely bring offerings and so on, I can't do because the Beis HaMikdash isn't there. So the priesthood comes to an end. It doesn't mean that there's no descendants of Aaron. Of course, we're here, but our function is removed. The word yikares can be killed, but it really means cut off. So there's your 490 years. Now, this doesn't work for Christianity at all on so many levels. The 6 things didn't occur. Moreover, from the time that Jesus was crucified, let's say in the year 30, I'm just going to say the year that he was crucified in the year 30. It really depends whether you follow the Synoptics or John. I'm just going to leave that alone, 30 or 33. Let's just take 30. That doesn't even work. It means, what do you do with the last week? If Jesus is executed in the year 30, and the temple is destroyed in the year 70, that means there's a 40-year gap. Well, 40 years is 5.5 weeks. Again, if each day is a year, so 40 years is 5.5 weeks. So, but it's not, it's a half a week. So what, you can ask the question, and you should ask the question, what do you do with this last week, and where's the half a week? So again, a Christian can't answer this. They can't answer this for the same reason that if you lie to a cop, you're going to get in trouble. When you make things up, you're going to get caught because you can't keep track of all your lies. That's why in my view, America's greatest writer and humorist was Mark Twain, who lived at the end of the 19th century, remarked that if you're telling the truth, you don't have to be very clever because you don't have to keep track of anything. Liars get into trouble. But if you're telling the truth, you'd have nothing to worry about. So you always just ask the question, just explain to me that if Jesus is executed in the year 30 or thereabout, where is the last week? And Christians have no clue what to do with this. No clue at all, because they're making this stuff up. And frequently Christians will say that last week is reserved for the end, and there's this thousands of years in between them. Well, that's a fatuous claim, but they're forced into this. So just ask, like, where is this last week and a half week? Like, when did that happen? How it's just completely made up. Moreover, I mean, just think for a moment. If, in fact, as missionaries insist, we have a timeline for precisely when the Messiah would be killed, and that is toward the end of the Second Temple period, in the year 30, as an example, why is this calculation never mentioned in the Christian Bible? And it isn't. Why isn't it there? Now, there are other parts of Daniel 9 that are mentioned in the Christian Bible. It's not like they didn't know that the chapter didn't exist, you know. Well, the answer is that they didn't invent this lie during the first century. It was only in the second century when people started using Daniel 9 or this supposed calculation to say, he died exactly when he was supposed to die. So this is all really quite silly. We always want to start, like, when do you start the calculation and when does it end, and why do you begin it there? And then immediately, who is this anointed individual who gives the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem? We know that as, just look at Isaiah 45, verse 1. It's right there. Cyrus, by name, is told that he's God's anointed who's going to give that command. So it's really very simple. Daniel miscalculated because he conflated 2 verses, and the angel Gabriel is there to unpack it for him, and the church subsequent to the canon would misappropriate this passage in order to say that it was predicted in the Hebrew Bible precisely when the Messiah was going to be crucified. Thank you for your question. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ואת נעשה בחפצו כל